In a quiet village surrounded by green hills and flowing streams, there lived a young woman named Mariam. She was admired and loved by everyone in the community because of her dedication to teaching the Quran. Mariam had memorized the entire Quran at a young age and chose to spend her life sharing its knowledge with others. Every morning, the sound of children reciting verses echoed from her small, humble home. This was a source of pride for the village, as Mariam was not just a teacher but a guide who inspired the children to lead righteous lives. Her students adored her, calling her Teacher Mariam with affection. Parents often praised her as a role model, saying, "If only all our children could grow up to be like her." Despite her modest living, Mariam never complained. She accepted small gifts or money from the families of her students to support herself and her aging father, who lived with her. Mariam's days were filled with reciting the Quran, teaching children, and caring for her father. Outwardly, she seemed like the perfect example of piety, and the villagers respected her deeply. But hidden behind this image was a secret struggle, a part of her life that no one in the village could see. Her father, Abdullah, was bedridden and completely dependent on Mariam. He often called out to her for help, asking for water or food, and she would attend to him. However, in private, Mariam's patience sometimes wore thin. She would sigh in frustration when he needed constant care, and sometimes she delayed attending to his needs, feeling overwhelmed. She told herself that providing him food and cleaning his room was enough, even if she felt no compassion in her heart. Unaware of this hidden aspect of her life, the villagers continued to see Mariam as a saintly figure. They admired her dedication and assumed her rewards in the hereafter would be immense. But Mariam herself carried a quiet guilt, a feeling that perhaps she was falling short in ways no one else could see. One quiet morning just after the Fajr prayer, the village awoke to heartbreaking news. Mariam had passed away in her sleep. The announcement spread quickly, and the entire community was shocked. The children she had taught gathered outside her home, many of them crying. Their small voices, usually filled with the melody of Quranic verses, were now trembling with sadness as they recited prayers for her soul. Parents comforted their children, saying, "She is in a better place now. Allah will reward her for all the good she did." The village imam, Sheikh Ibrahim, decided to lead her funeral prayer himself, saying, "Mariam was one of the most pious individuals in our community. It is our honor to give her a proper farewell." The preparation for her burial began immediately. The gravedigger, Abdullah, was tasked with digging her final resting place. Abdullah was known for his steady hands and his devotion to this sacred duty. He had dug countless graves over the years, but he approached Mariam's grave with a special sense of responsibility. "She was such a righteous soul," he murmured to himself. "This is an honor for me." As he walked to the cemetery with his tools, a strange uneasiness settled over him. The air felt heavier than usual, and he couldn't shake off a feeling of discomfort. Shaking his head, he thought, "Perhaps I'm just imagining things. This is Mariam's grave. What could possibly go wrong?" The villagers began to gather for the funeral procession. Men carried her body, wrapped in a white shroud, while the women and children followed, reciting verses from the Quran. The atmosphere was somber but filled with reverence. No one doubted that Mariam would be welcomed into paradise with open arms. But as the crowd approached the cemetery, an unusual tension began to rise. Abdullah was struggling to dig the grave. The ground felt unnaturally hard, as if it was resisting him. His spade struck stones with every attempt, making the task far more difficult than usual. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he tried again and again. Finally, after much effort, Abdullah managed to dig a grave deep enough to lay the body to rest. But just as he stepped back to inspect his work, a dark shadow caught his eye. Emerging from the edge of the grave was a snake, long, black, and menacing. It coiled at the edge, its tongue flicking out as if guarding the spot. The crowd gasped in horror. "A snake?" someone whispered. "How can this be? It's Mariam's grave." The imam quickly recited protective prayers, urging everyone to remain calm. But the uneasiness in the air grew heavier and whispers began to spread. What does this mean? The presence of the snake left the crowd in shock. Mothers pulled their children closer while men stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Abdullah, the gravedigger, tried to approach the grave cautiously, but the snake raised its head and hissed fiercely, its sharp fangs visible. Fear gripped everyone, and no one dared to step forward. Sheikh Ibrahim, though shaken, took control of the situation. "Recite Ayatul Kursi," he instructed the crowd, his voice steady despite the tension. The villagers began reciting in unison, hoping the divine verses would dispel whatever evil was present. As their voices filled the air, the snake momentarily retreated, slithering into the shadows of the grave. "Quickly, let's proceed with the burial," Sheikh Ibrahim urged. The men carrying Mariam's body carefully approached the grave, lowering her shrouded form into it. But just as they began to cover her with soil, a terrifying sight stopped them. The ground around the grave began to tremble, and out of nowhere more snakes appeared, thin, writhing and hissing. Scorpions, their tails arched and ready to strike, crawled out of the disturbed soil. Gasps and screams erupted from the crowd. Mothers shielded their children's eyes, and even the bravest men stepped back in fear. "It's as if the grave itself is rejecting her," someone cried out, their voice filled with disbelief. Abdullah, pale and sweating, dropped his spade and turned to the imam. "Sheikh, I've dug hundreds of graves, but I've never seen anything like this. Why is this happening to her? She was a hafiza, a teacher of the Quran." Sheikh Ibrahim raised his hands to silence the crowd. "This is a test for all of us," he said solemnly. "We cannot jump to conclusions. Only Allah knows the truth of what lies in our hearts." Despite the sheikh's calm demeanor, the villagers couldn't contain their whispers. How could this happen to Mariam? She was so righteous. Did she commit a sin we don't know about? Questions swirled as the snake and scorpions continued to infest the grave. "Take the body out," Sheikh Ibrahim finally commanded. "We cannot bury her here. We must seek Allah's guidance first." Reluctantly, the men lifted Mariam's body out of the grave. Her shroud remained untouched, but the sight of the writhing creatures beneath her was enough to leave everyone unsettled. The body was carried back to the mosque, where the crowd gathered in silence, their earlier reverence replaced by confusion and fear. Sheikh Ibrahim, visibly distressed, sat down and closed his eyes, whispering prayers under his breath. Finally he spoke. "There is more to this story than we know. Allah is just, and He does not wrong His servants. We must uncover the truth." The villagers nodded in agreement, their curiosity and unease growing stronger. What could Mariam have done to deserve such a fate? Let me know when to continue with the next section. Back at the mosque, a heavy silence hung over the crowd. Mariam's body lay respectfully covered in the prayer hall, surrounded by people reciting verses from the Quran. Despite their prayers, uneasiness gripped everyone. The sight of snakes and scorpions emerging from her grave had left them shaken. Sheikh Ibrahim sat at the front of the mosque, deep in thought. His heart was heavy, and his mind was racing. Why would the grave reject Mariam? What could have gone wrong? He raised his hands in supplication, seeking Allah's guidance. After a moment he stood and addressed the crowd. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice calm but firm. "This is a reminder that only Allah knows the hidden truths of our lives. Outward appearances can be deceiving, and we must not rush to judge anyone. However, this situation is unusual, and we need to find answers. Does anyone know of any hidden matters regarding Mariam's life?" The crowd remained silent for a moment before an elderly woman, Fatima, stepped forward. She was Mariam's next-door neighbor and had known her for years. "Sheikh, Mariam was a good woman," Fatima said hesitantly. "She taught the Quran to our children and she prayed 5 times a day, but there was one thing." The crowd leaned in, their curiosity piqued. Fatima continued. Her father, Abdullah, was bedridden. He relied on her for everything: food, water, and care. Mariam looked after him, but she often seemed frustrated. I've seen her sigh and walk away when he called out to her. Once I even heard her say, "Why can't you just manage on your own?" Gasps spread through the mosque. "What are you saying, Fatima?" one man asked. "Mariam was a righteous woman. How could she be impatient with her father?" Fatima shook her head sadly. "I don't mean to speak ill of her. I just noticed these things. She fulfilled her duties, but sometimes she lacked kindness. I once heard her raise her voice at him, and it troubled me." I never thought it was a serious matter, though. Sheikh Ibrahim's face grew serious. In Islam, serving one's parents, especially in their old age, is a sacred duty. Allah commands us to lower our wings of humility to them and never even say, "Oof," in frustration. It is a grave matter if we fail in this duty. The crowd murmured amongst themselves, many reflecting on their own treatment of their parents. Could this be why the grave rejected her? Someone asked quietly. Sheikh Ibrahim raised his hand for silence. We cannot jump to conclusions. We must seek more information. Did Mariam have anyone close to her, someone who might know more about her private life? Fatima hesitated before replying. She had a close friend, Aisha, who lived in this village. They were like sisters, but Aisha moved away months ago after they had a falling out. Sheikh Ibrahim nodded thoughtfully. Then we must find Aisha. Perhaps she knows something that can explain this. We cannot proceed with the burial until we understand what Allah is trying to show us. The sheikh selected 2 trustworthy men and instructed them to go to the nearby village where Aisha now lived. Find her and bring her here. Tell her it is a matter of urgency, he said. As the men set out to find Aisha, the villagers stayed in the mosque, their hearts heavy with uncertainty. Sheikh Ibrahim offered 2 units of voluntary prayer, seeking clarity and mercy from Allah. The crowd waited, their whispers growing louder. What could Mariam have done? Why would Allah punish her like this? The answer seemed elusive, but the tension in the air only deepened. 2 days passed, and the villagers waited anxiously for the return of the men sent to find Aisha. The crowd gathered at the mosque daily, reciting prayers and discussing Mariam's life in hushed tones. The sight of the snake and scorpions had left an indelible mark on their hearts, and questions about Mariam's hidden life swirled endlessly. Finally, on the evening of the 2nd day, a commotion stirred outside the mosque. The 2 men had returned, and with them was Aisha, veiled and visibly distressed. Tears streamed down her face as she approached Sheikh Ibrahim, her hands trembling. "Sheikh, I cannot believe this," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "They told me what happened at Mariam's grave. How could this be? She was my dearest friend. She was so pious, so devoted." Sheikh Ibrahim gently motioned for her to sit and speak. "Aisha, we need to know the truth. You were close to Mariam, perhaps closer than anyone else. Did she ever share anything with you, any struggles, any sins she might have committed? Allah does not punish without reason." Aisha hesitated, her hands clutching the edge of her veil. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Mariam and I grew up together," she began. "We both memorized the Quran as children, and we always dreamed of teaching others. But as we grew older, I noticed changes in her. Her outward devotion never wavered, but her heart, it became hardened." The crowd listened intently as Aisha continued. Her father was very old and bedridden. He depended on her for everything, and at first she cared for him with love. But over time she became frustrated. She would complain that she had no life of her own, that she was sacrificing too much for him. She still fulfilled his needs. She fed him, cleaned him, and gave him water. But there was no kindness in her actions. Aisha paused, her voice trembling. "I remember one night in particular. Her father called out to her repeatedly, asking for water. She ignored him for hours, saying, 'He'll be fine. He just wants attention.' When she finally went to him, she was so angry that she spilled the water on the floor and told him, 'You're a burden to me.'" Gasps filled the mosque as the villagers exchanged shocked glances. Aisha's tears fell freely now. "I confronted her about it the next day. I told her that serving her father was an act of worship, a duty that could bring her immense rewards. But she became defensive. She said, 'I've done enough. No one knows the sacrifices I've made.' After that, our friendship grew strained, and I eventually moved away." Sheikh Ibrahim closed his eyes, his heart heavy with sorrow. "Aisha," he said softly, "did Mariam ever repent for her behavior? Did she ever express regret?" Aisha shook her head. "I don't know, Sheikh. She never spoke to me about it again, but I know she struggled in her heart. She wanted to do the right thing, but her frustration got the better of her." The Sheikh sighed deeply and turned to the crowd. "Brothers and sisters," he said, his voice firm, "this is a powerful reminder for all of us. Allah commands us to treat our parents with kindness and humility, even when it is difficult. The Quran says, "Say not to them a word of disrespect, nor repel them, but address them in terms of honor." Mariam's outward piety could not compensate for the lack of mercy she showed to her father. This is why her grave has rejected her. The villagers sat in stunned silence, reflecting on their own relationships with their parents. The sheikh continued, "It is not too late for us to learn from this. Seek forgiveness from your parents while you still have the chance. And if they have passed, pray for their souls and honor their memory." As the sheikh spoke, many in the crowd began to weep, their hearts heavy with regret and fear. As the weight of Mariam's hidden struggle became clear, the atmosphere in the mosque grew somber. Sheikh Ibrahim, visibly emotional, stood silently for a moment before speaking again. "Aisha, thank you for sharing the truth. This is not about condemnation, but understanding. Allah alone knows what was in Mariam's heart, and we must pray for her forgiveness." The sheikh turned toward the body of Mariam, which lay still and covered in a shroud. He then addressed the crowd. "Brothers and sisters, we must remember that no one is free from mistakes. Even those who appear pious may carry hidden burdens. Allah is the most merciful, and we must seek His mercy for Mariam." He knelt in prayer, raising his hands high. His voice broke as he called out, "Ya Allah, you are the most forgiving." If Mariam faltered in her duties to her father, it was out of human weakness. Please forgive her, for she spent her life spreading your word and teaching children the Quran. Do not let her good deeds go unrewarded. The crowd followed his lead, tears streaming down their faces as they prayed for Mariam. Her students, many of them young children, wept openly. One little boy, barely 10 years old, cried, "She was like a mother to us. Please, Allah, forgive her and give her peace." After the prayers, the sheikh turned to the men who had been with Abdullah, the gravedigger. "We will try to bury her again, but this time we must approach with humility and repentance. Allah is testing all of us, not just Mariam." The second attempt. The villagers gathered at the cemetery once more, their hearts heavy with apprehension. The snake and scorpions that had infested the grave earlier were nowhere to be seen, but the unease in the air remained. Abdullah, his hands trembling, began digging again under the sheikh's instructions. The soil, which had been heavy and resistant before, now seemed slightly easier to work with. The villagers watched in silence, each of them reciting prayers under their breath. But just as the grave was prepared and Mariam's body was carried toward it, a chilling sight stopped everyone in their tracks. A large black snake appeared once again, its eyes gleaming and its body coiling near the grave. It hissed loudly, as if warning them to stay away. Gasps erupted from the crowd. The snake's sudden appearance felt like a direct message. "The grave is still rejecting her," someone whispered fearfully. Sheikh Ibrahim stepped forward, his face calm but determined. He began reciting Ayatul Kursi, his voice steady and powerful. As the verses echoed through the cemetery, the snake began to retreat. It slithered away slowly, disappearing into the shadows of the nearby trees. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief. "We have done all we can," the sheikh said. "Let us proceed with the burial. The rest is now between Mariam and Allah." A lesson for all. Mariam's body was finally lowered into the grave, and the villagers worked together to cover her with soil. The sheikh stood at the edge of the grave, his hands raised in supplication. "Ya Allah, forgive her shortcomings and grant her peace. Let her good deeds shine in your sight, and grant her a place among the righteous." As the final prayers were completed, the villagers began to leave, their hearts heavy but reflective. Sheikh Ibrahim gathered the children and spoke gently to them. "Remember this, my dear ones. Allah loves those who are kind to their parents. Never take their love and sacrifices for granted. Serve them with patience, and you will find blessings in this world and the hereafter." The children nodded solemnly, many of them wiping away tears. The adults, too, reflected on the powerful lesson they had witnessed. As the villagers walked away from the cemetery, their footsteps were slow, and their hearts were heavy. The events they had witnessed were unlike anything they had ever experienced. The image of the snake and scorpions refusing to leave Mariam's grave lingered in their minds, serving as a chilling reminder of the consequences of hidden sins, even for those who appeared righteous. Sheikh Ibrahim stayed behind, standing quietly by the grave. He reflected on the profound lesson that had unfolded. Outward piety is meaningless if our hearts are not pure. True worship is reflected in how we treat those closest to us, especially our parents. In the days that followed, the story of Mariam's burial spread far beyond the village. People from neighboring towns came to learn what had happened. The villagers, humbled and reflective, shared the lesson they had learned. That kindness and patience toward parents are acts of worship, as important as prayer and fasting. Many villagers began to reevaluate their own relationships with their parents. Children returned home and hugged their mothers and fathers tightly, apologizing for any disrespectful words or actions. Adults visited their elderly parents, bringing them gifts and spending time with them, realizing that every moment was precious. One young man, deeply moved by the story, approached Sheikh Ibrahim and said, "I've been too busy with work to visit my mother. I haven't seen her in months. But after witnessing this, I will go to her today. I will ask for her forgiveness." The sheikh placed a hand on the man's shoulder and smiled. "This is what Allah wants from us, to honor our parents and serve them with love. It is never too late to change." Mariam's story became a lesson that the village passed down through generations. Parents used it to teach their children about the importance of gratitude and kindness, while elders reminded their communities of the sacred duty to care for one's parents. Though Mariam had faltered in her treatment of her father, the villagers chose to remember her for her good deeds as well. Sheikh Ibrahim often reminded them, "Let us not judge her harshly. None of us are free from mistakes. May Allah forgive her and grant her peace." The graveyard, once a quiet and forgotten place, became a site of reflection for the villagers. People would visit not just to pray for the deceased, but to remind themselves of the lessons Mariam's story had taught them. Years later, when Sheikh Ibrahim himself was nearing the end of his life, he sat beneath a tree near the cemetery and reflected on the events of that fateful day. He raised his hands in prayer, his voice soft but resolute. "Ya Allah, guide us to be obedient to our parents. Help us fulfill their rights and forgive us for our shortcomings. Let us never take their sacrifices for granted. And when our time comes, grant us an honorable burial and a place among the righteous. Ameen." His words became the foundation of a prayer that the villagers recited often, a lasting tribute to the lessons learned from Mariam's life and death. And so, the story of Mariam, the righteous Hafiza, and the snakes in her grave lived on. Not as a tale of condemnation, but as a reminder of the sacred duty owed to parents and the power of repentance.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.